Wang Changling, Spring in the Palace. In last night's wind, the peach by the well opened its flowers. The moon rose like a bright wheel above the Wei-Yang Palace. After the singing and dancing at Pingyang's, the emperor found his favorite and gave her a brocade robe against the spring chill. So this is the third and last of Wang Changling's heptasyllabic quatrains included in this anthology. And this one has a curious subject matter. I could say that it's a historical or historicist poem, as it's basically evoking an anecdote from the history books and from more than 500 years before Wang Changling's time, an episode that happened in the Western Han Dynasty. Basically, what is being described is how the emperor fell for a lowly dancer who would later become his empress, and that is briefly described in the poem. You could say that other minor topics or minor themes in the poem are also the coming of spring, and there's a way, that's not exactly a topic or a subject in the poem, but I think there is an intricate weaving of the natural imagery with the subjective message of, the emperor finding the beauty he loves. But we will comment that when we go on to the couplets. So first off, let's mention the anecdote that is behind this poem, because its clarification will help us understand the background. So this poem is about Han Wudi. Han Wudi was one of the great emperors of the Western Han Dynasty, if not the greatest, and a very long-lived one. I think he spent at least 40-something years on the throne, which for many centuries was an unparalleled record. Basically, he ruled in the middle years, early to middle to late middle years of the second century of our era, BC. And his reign was important in many respects, basically because China waged many wars with the barbarians, with the Xiongnu, quite successfully. The territory of the empire was massively expanded in this period, although at an enormous cost in loss of human blood. And as I said, Han Wudi was a pretty successful emperor, but he was also what we would certainly feel in the West as a very tyrannical emperor, hardly any different except in different historical times and contexts from the first emperor, who was generally vilified in the Chinese tradition as the worst sort of tyrant. He was a ruthless man, ready to execute failed generals and all their families, and to believe in absurd and invented palace conspiracies. But generally in China, as I said, he has a good reputation because he was successful. He, managed to unify the empire effectively and wage successful campaigns against the barbarians. So the anecdote, he had many empresses, or at least two or three. And the first empress with which he was married, Empress Chen, didn't give him any children, and she was a bit older than him, and she had married him when he was still young and not an emperor, so she had been an asset in that climb. But he got bored with her. And the anecdote described here is how he met the one that would become his next empress. So it was relatively well known already that he wasn't getting along with the empress. So his sister, I think, Princess Pingyang, organized a party with the intention of ingratiating herself with her brother by finding for him some lovely concubines. And, the emperor came, and Princess Pingyang showed some concubines. None of them impressed the emperor. But after that, she staged a dance with other servants, a dance and singing spectacle. And there the emperor got caught in the webs, completely fell for one of the singer dancers. And later on, this woman would become his second empress, Empress Wei. I think it's Empress Wei. Yeah. And she had a big influence in her husband, and her relations got good imperial patronage, and two of them were very successful generals of Han Wudi in the fight against the barbarians. I think it was Wei Cheng, and Hua Chuping, the general of the Agile Cavalry. Anyway, Rags to Riches story, although it doesn't have a happy ending, although that is not mentioned in the poem, as when in his old age the emperor became mistrustful and deluded by eunuchs and bad counselors, he believed that his son and crown prince, the son of Empress Wei, was conspiring through voodoo magic to get him to an early grave, and this led to a mutiny of the crown prince and to his suicide, along with the suicide of his mother, the empress. So that's the story. So it's a love story, you could say, an imperial love story, and a story of rags to riches in this anecdote that is being portrayed here. So let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet and clarify a few aspects. The first couplet. In the last night's wind, the peach by the well opened its flowers. The moon rose like a bright wheel above the Wei-Yang palace. As usual, the first couplet usually introduces time and place. So the first line very clearly tells us that it's spring, because petals flourish in early spring, especially peach petals, because plum petals already start blossoming in winter, late winter, early spring. But peaches, in the Chinese tradition, peach flowers are generally associated with the beginning of spring. So in this night, the wind seems to have opened the peach flowers, yeah, or the peach that was by the well, and any peach could be next to the well, but wells, gardens with wells, sometimes especially when the wells are described as having a golden railing, immediately connect with the imperial palace, to the reader who is aware of the symbol. The second line, the moon rose. Remember, it was last night, so it was at night. Something happened at night, the beginning of spring. Remember, spring is associated in the Chinese tradition with love. And so it's very easy to see that probably these peach blossoms opening are indicative, are metaphorical, are the natural correlate of love blossoming in the material realm, in this case in the emperor's bosom. The moon rose like a bright wheel above the Wei-Yang palace. So the second line continues to give us an image of nature, what happened at night. The moon rose and as a big wheel, and moon, again, a symbol of beauty, of romanticism. A moon rising could be interpreted, among other things, as the rising of this new paramour for the emperor, a beautiful woman on the rise. And now here we have clearly the indication that we're talking about an imperial context, because the moon was rising above the Wei-Yang palace. The Wei-Yang palace was the main imperial palace in Chang'an during the Western Han Dynasty. There was the Changling palace in the center and the Wei-Yang towards the west. And it was especially the main palace for the emperor and the place where the big audience halls were. And during the Tang, it was actually another palace was built, also called the Wei-Yang Palace, which was for the keeping of the imperial concubines. So the contemporaneous associations would also feed on this image of the emperor in love in early spring. Second couplet. So the first couplet set the scene. The second couplet is going to give us a little bit more detail. From the first couplet, we can interpret that we're going to read something about love, or perhaps the frustration of love in early spring, in the imperial palace of the Han Dynasty. So probably a Han Dynasty anecdote. After the singing and dancing at Pingyang's, the emperor found his favorite and gave her a brocade robe against the spring chill. So the second couplet actually explains the story pretty straightforwardly and pretty quickly. So after the setting of the first couplet, the denouement comes pretty rapidly. What has happened? What are these symbols of nature? These peaches blossoming next to the well, this moon rising brightly over the imperial palace. What do these portents show, or what do they evoke? Well, the emperor has spent a night of pleasure, singing and dancing, at Pingyang, that is, at his sister's palace, and the emperor has found his favorite. And the emperor finally gives her. Who is this her? I imagine it's the the woman she has found, but it could well be the Pingyang princess. So he gave her a brocade robe against the spring chill. So the emperor, bestowing his love and his favor upon this new concubine, is symbolized, is metonymicized through the emperor giving the woman a brocade robe, a beautiful, luxurious robe, to protect her from the cold. This is spring. It's not the season of heat yet. Warmth starts growing. So the first stirrings of the imperial affection become symbolized by this gift of a brocade robe to protect from the chill. Now she will be warmed by the warmth of the emperor's desire and by the emperor's love. So that's it. I think that's all that can be said about this poem. It participates in the romantic and historicist atmosphere that is pretty typical of some poems that are inspired in the Juefu. Perhaps some of the early quatrains imitating the ones of the Six Dynasties. But okay, it's a pretty effective piece of imagery.